Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks, and this week we're taking a look at the worst thing Fender have ever done to a Telecaster. That's of course, top-loading bridge. So if you saw a video I made last year making a case for the Fender Telecaster potentially being the greatest guitar design ever, you may remember me saying the one thing that is so particularly impressive about it is that since its introduction in 1951, it's hardly changed, and save for a few very subtle variations over the years, ash bodies, alder bodies, maple necks, rosewood fingerboards, etc., it's remained remarkably consistent, with the exception of the top-loading bridge. So what is a top-loading bridge? Now, all of Leo Fender's first ever guitar designs, the Esquire and the Telecaster by extension, the P-Bass and the Stratocaster were at least initially what we know and think of as string-through bodies. This meaning that in order to string it up, you pass the string through a hole on the back of the body, the ferrule, through to the bridge, up over the saddle, up to the tuning peg. However, in the midpoint of 1958, presumably as a cost and time-cutting measure, Fender introduced the top-loading bridge to the Telecaster. This essentially meaning that instead of passing the string through the body, it simply went through a hole on the bottom of the bridge before passing up over the saddle, up to the tuning peg. Now, while bass players didn't seem to mind this innovation in 1957 when it was introduced to the P-Bass, guitarists, being a famously funny lot, absolutely hated it, and by the midpoint of 1959, only a year later, Fender had been forced into a U-turn, going back to string-through bodies. However, clearly not anticipating such a negative response, Fender were lumbered with several thousand top-loading bridges. Now, Leo Fender, famously thrifty, simply had them re-drilled to accommodate the string-through bodies, and these were actually being used on Telecasters until mid-1962. Such was their stock before it was depleted. So why are top loaders so maligned? Now, in the interest of transparency, I should declare my allegiance here and say that my first ever guitar, a Squier Affinity Telecaster, was a top loader. So for the longest time, I knew absolutely no different. And of course, as Joe Bonamassa says,
now there's a lot of debate on these, whether they are better or worse. I defy anybody to be able to tell the difference sonically. I have one at home and they're wonderful.
I think the genesis of their bad reputation primarily comes down to the fact that they weren't initially successful. Now, the reasons for this, or the specific reasons, have kind of been lost to the mists of time, but the fact that Fender did such a quick U-turn on their decision to include them on all Telecasters and Esquires, kind of a testament to that, and does lead to the impression that it was just a big mistake. Couple that with the fact that over the years they've also been dogged by the perception that the string not passing through the body does have an adverse effect on the guitar's resonance and sustain. Also, I think our perception of what constitutes a good guitar is very much influenced by whether our heroes played one. And given they were produced for such a brief period of time, you would be forgiven for thinking that there are no famous musicians who played a top-loading Telecaster, in which case you would be very much wrong. Jimmy Page's infamous Dragon Telecaster, that he not only used on Led Zeppelin 1, but on arguably one of the most famous guitar solos of all time, in Stairway to Heaven, was of course a top-loading Telecaster that happened to have been given to him as a present by none other than Jeff Beck. In this next clip by the Fender Custom Shop talking about the recreation of that guitar recently, you can see Fender master builder Paul Waller talking about the construction of that guitar and how it is a little bit misleading to think of it solely as a top-loading Telecaster, as it did have the capacity, or does have the capacity, to be strung as a string-through. This implies it is a late 59 body with an early 58 neck, so they're a little bit confused as to the origins of that guitar. Either way, every clip I found of Jimmy using it does clearly show him using it as a top loader.
In 59, they had done a top load only without the option to string through, and this actually had both. So it's hard to say whether it was an early production guitar of the 59 that made its way to Europe, or it was a parts caster that got assembled after the fact with leftover parts. So.
Aside from Jimmy Page, another notable top loader is of course the brilliant Jim Campilongo, who, despite initial negative responses to his 59 Telecaster, thankfully persevered.
And it's a top loader, which I didn't know. I mean, somebody actually gave me this guitar about 20 years ago. And I loved it. I just loved the guitar. And then about 6 months later, somebody goes, "Oh, that's a top loader. You know, that's kind of a dog." And my feelings are hurt. You know, I was like, "What do you mean?" And they go, "Well, the strings don't go through the body. They just go through the end here." And that's what makes this guitar unique, and that's what makes a 59 unique.
Unsurprisingly, after such a disastrous introduction in 1958, Fender shelved the idea of top-loading Telecasters until 1983. Strangely, on a series of guitars that, considering they have two particularly notable examples, generally speaking aren't particularly well thought of. Heavy mahogany Telecasters with slightly microphonic pickups seems to be the general complaint. That said, Jeff Buckley's main guitar on Grace was a 1983 top-loading Telecaster, obviously now owned by Matt Bellamy of Muse, I should say, as is the Telecaster used on Crazy Little Thing Called Love at Live 8 by Freddie Mercury. However, it is interesting to see that on Fender's most recent American-made line of Telecasters, the American Professional 2, not only do you have the option to string through, but you also have the option to top load, which presents itself as a rather cool opportunity for a little bit of a shootout. Now, I'm not expecting to hear any sonic difference, to be honest, even more so in light of Joe Bonamassa's comments, but the one thing that does intrigue me is to see whether there's any perceptible difference in feel, which, over the years, has been a very common observation. The theory being that the decreased break angle of the strings over the back of the saddles down to the bridge makes it slightly easier to bend. And the size of this is called compliance, essentially meaning that there's less resting string tension, making it easier to bend the strings. I've done an entire video on this. It's very similar to theory to top wrapping a Les Paul, but every time I bring it up, the DIY Isaac Newtons appear in the comment section and I get torn to shreds, so I'm not going to say too much about it, apart from, let's take a listen. So there you have it. Now, I'm not going to say too much here on the comparison clips, as I think part of the fun is letting you come to your own conclusions. But if I'm entirely honest, I couldn't really hear any sonic differences at all. And as much as my brain may be telling me that there is a slight difference in tension, or pliability, should we say, to avoid getting bogged down in terms between the two, I don't think it's anything worth writing a PhD on anytime soon. It does kind of lead me to the conclusion that, unsurprisingly, the great top-loading debate is us guitarists getting all hot and bothered over nothing. Let's face it, it wouldn't be the first time. As ever, I'm Chris Buck. Thank you very much for watching Friday Fretworks. Please subscribe, hit the bell icon if you haven't already, and I shall see you next week for another episode. Cheers, guys. Take care. I'll see you soon.